Okay, in this video I want to build on my knowledge of arrays, and I'm going to switch things up a bit, and we're going to have an array of questions this time and an array of answers. So in the last video we had an array which had a question and an answer in. Today we're going to have an array of questions and an array of answers. So yeah, I've got the Python idle environment here. So this is my shell. Whenever we create any code, we execute it so it runs in the shell. It's good practice to create your code in its own separate Python module. So we just do File, New, and build our code in here. So again, we're working with arrays today. So if you remember, an array is a list of items. It could be numbers, it could be strings, or any other type of data. So here I'm going to call my questions array questions, and I'm going to type some questions in here. I'm going to just make this a bit bigger so it doesn't go off the screen while I'm doing this. So, you know, we love this pentagon. How many sides does a pentagon have? That's my first item in the array. The second question is going to be what is the colour, or what colour signifies danger? What colour signifies danger? And the last one would be what year was the Bond film Spectre? Make that a couple less. Released. That's the end of my array there. So I've got 1, 2, 3 items in my array, and remember our array is 0 index, so it's 0, 1, 2 as the index of each item in that array. So I'm going to create a second array called answers, and I'm going to give it the answers to these questions in the order that these questions appear. So at the 0 index, how many sides does a pentagon have? The answer will be 5. At the 1 index, what colour signifies danger? And the answer is red. And then for the last one, what year was the Bond film Spectre released? Well, it was released this year. It's currently on at the cinemas at the time of making this video. Now let's just see what we did there. So in this array, we've got an integer, a string, and an integer, and that's perfectly fine. You can mix up integers and strings in an array, that's no problem. Python can handle that. One of the good things about Python. Okay, so I'm going to just do like a loop that's going to loop through each of these questions and ask my user to input their answer. So although I've got 3 items in the array, I actually only want to count to 2. So I want to go, the current count is 0, show this question. If the current count is 1, show this question. And if the current count is 2, show this question. So I'm going to use a while loop. Nice, easy, clean loop to use. You could use a for loop if you wanted, but I'm going to go with a while loop because I think it's quite easy to do what I want in a while loop here. It's a determinate loop. I know how many times around the loop I want to go. I've only got 3 questions, but I've got the index 2 here. Oh, I'm getting a bit of ahead of myself. I haven't created my question count variable, so question count is going to count each question each time around the loop. I'm going to set it to 0 to start with. And for this one I do want an answer variable, and I'll describe why in a minute. So I'll just create an empty string for my answer variable. Do I? No, sorry, I'm getting confused with something else I was doing. Forget about the answer variable. Just erase that from your mind and pretend that never happened. Okay, so while question count is less than or equal to 2, do something. And the something is going to happen 3 times. So the first time round, question count will be 0. The second time round, it'll be 1. And the third time round, it'll be 2. So the first time in, I'm going to get the user's guess, and I'm going to output So I use the input function to get the user's guess, and then I'll output the question, this question here, which is questions. So I'm getting the first item in my question array. Now I'm going to use this question count, to get my index. So before we would have done something like this to get the first item in the array, but because I'm using a loop and this value is going to change every time we come around the loop, I'm going to use this question count to signify the index in the array that I want to access. So this is going to say get this question of question count. So the first time in the loop the question count is 0, so it'll go to the first item in the array, and ask my user that question. Get my user to input a response to that question. And just like before, I'm adding a question mark here, so I don't have to add it 3 times here. It doesn't really matter. You could add it 3 times there, but it means if I want to change it to another symbol, I only need to do it once here. So that's getting my user's guess. Then I want to get the answer. Actually, no, I don't need the answer. What I want to do, just like in the last video, is I want to say if user guess is exactly equal to the current answer. So I go to my answers array and I get the current index. So remember, these questions map on to these answers. So the first question at index 0 has the same answer at index 0 here. The second question at index 1 has the same answer at index 1 here. The third question at index 2 has the same answer at index 2 here. So I say if user's guess is this exactly equal to the current, should be, I'm going to call that count actually, shouldn't I? It's not a question count, it's a question and answer count. So let's just call it count. That's a more sensible variable name because I'm going to use it for both the question, to get the index of both the question array and the answers array. So we'll go down to here. We've got our count. So we're saying if the user's guess is exactly equal to the answer at the current point in the answer question answer array, then print correct, else, oh, forgot my colon again, I always forget that little tinker, print incorrect. Now remember, some of these values here are integers and some are strings, and as we found out in the last video, if you've got an integer as a value, you can't compare it to a string input, and the input function defines a string input. So we've got to use a string function to convert this answer to a string. So if the answer is this one here, we need to convert it to a string using the string function. If it's this one here, it doesn't matter, but using the string function won't create a problem. It'll just have a little bit extra processing and memory. And this one here also needs to be converted to a string. So if user's guess equals answer's guess, if user's guess equals the current answer, print correct, else print incorrect. So let's just run this and see what happens. So the first time round, I would expect, let me save this, trivia, actually we'll just overwrite that trivia apply because that was just something I was messing about with earlier. Yep, we can replace that. Oh, invalid syntax. Just like I always forget the colon on the end of the if statement, I forgot it on the while loop as well. So, brilliant. Let's run it, save it, and let's go. So, what happened there? The while loop came into here and it says, is count less than 2? Well, count is currently equal to 0 because that's what we set it to here. So then we've said, can we get, can we output the question to the user and ask the user to enter or input a response to this question? And the question it's going to ask is the question in the array, the questions array at count. So it's the first time round, so count is currently 0, so it goes to the first item or the item in the array of index 0. So it's how many sides does a pentagon have? So if we add a response there, I'm going to say 2, which is obviously the incorrect answer. I would expect that the response would be incorrect. So press return incorrect. Okay, no problem. Oh, what I didn't expect there. Okay, so what happened there was I typed in 2, so user's guess became 2. So this is if statement said if 2 is exactly equal to the item in the answers array that's at the current count, which is 0. So if 2 is exactly equal to 5, print correct, else print incorrect. Then I expect it to go to the next question in the array. Well, it didn't go to the next question in the array because it's always count is always 0. I never add 1 to count, so I missed a little bit out there. So what I actually want to do is when we get to the end of all of this here, add 1 to 0. So count plus equals 1 is the same as saying count equals count plus 1. Exactly the same. Just the shorthand version, if you like. So we'll just run this module again. So now I'm going to give it the right answer. How many sides does pentagon have? 5. Correct. I got that right. And it moves on to the next question. What colour signifies danger? So what happened there was it came round the while loop and said count now equals 1. So ask the user the question at index 1 in the questions array. Go to the questions array, got index 0 and index 1. What colour signifies danger? So if I type in blue here, I'd expect this to fail. And I'd expect it to fail because the next test will be if blue is exactly equal to the item in the answers array of the current count. Remember, current count is 1 now. So if we go to the answers array and we look at index 0, index 1, the answer is red. So I'd expect this to fail. So incorrect. Brilliant. That's exactly what I want to see. So now we're looking for index at item 2 because we've added a 1 on to count. It's the third time around the loop. So the first time around was 0. The second time around was 1. And now we're up to 2. So question 2 or question at index 2, 0, 1, 2 is what year was the Bond film. And it's going to check against the answer at index 2, 0, 1, 2. So the answer will be 215. Now I've cheated and I know the answer. I'll put that in. Correct. Excellent. And it's come to the end. I can see that it's come to the end of my program because there's 3 arrows there or 3 chevrons there. So that's it. That's the end of my question and answers. So now we can see how we can use a questions array and an answers array to be able to loop around those questions and answers to to ask some questions and test some answers. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? And I think that's a better way for those of you that are doing the assignment to do your question and answers, or ask your questions and test your answers. The only thing I haven't done, which I won't do because that would be making it too easy for you, is the randomizing of asking the questions and answers. So I'll leave that one to you to figure out. So when you do the randomizing, you're going to ask a random question. You probably won't need a while loop in because you're going to continue. Oh, actually, take that back. Erase what I just said. You will need some kind of while loop in, but it won't be for a count. It'll be some sort of test against whether your turtle has hit the finish line or not. I'll leave you with thinking about that. And I would definitely recommend do not try to go straight in and code doing questions continuously till your turtle hits the finish line. I would definitely recommend sit and plan that out, whether it's in pseudocode or a flow chart. plan it out before you start to code it, or you'll get in a pickle. And that's the end of this screencast. In this video, I want to build on this question and answer scenario, and I'm actually going to introduce the idea of creating some objects. I don't want to overwhelm you with the idea of classes and objects, but we'll just give it a brief introduction here. An object is something that's modelled on an instance of something. So, for example, a person. Take this back a bit. A class defines what an object is, what its attributes and methods are, and an object is an instance of that class. So, for example, a person is a class, and every person has a name, an age, a height, hair colour, for example. Those are all of the things that describe a person. But it's not until you have an instance of a person that they become an object. So, for example, I'm a person, my name is Kay, I'm an instance of a person. I've got brown hair, brown eyes, I'm 5'6". If you took another person, such as yourself, you're another instance of the person class, and you've got a height, eye colour, hair colour, and so on. And we can define classes within Python or in most programming languages. So I'm going to show you how to define a question class that contains a question and an answer property in Python. So as usual, we'll start off with a Python idle shell. We'll just do File, a new file, and we're going to create our class in here. So the class that I want to create is a question class, and in order to be able to create a class or define a class in Python, we need to use this class keyword, and my class is going to be called question. And whenever I create an instance of a class, remember I said an instance of a class becomes an object. So if I want to create an instance of my question class and set it a question and an answer property, I need to pass in the object that's getting assigned that information. So that's our question class created there. But it doesn't really do anything. At the minute, it doesn't have any properties. There's nothing there, is there? So if this was a person class, we'll just go back. We'll probably want to assign it some properties like name or height or hair color, for example. But we haven't given any properties here. At this minute, it's saying that you've got a person class that has no properties and no methods associated with it. So how do we go about giving it some properties and methods? Well, first of all, we need to initialize our class. And the way that we initialize our class is to create a function called init, like this. This is a predefined function, so whenever our question class or an instance of our question class is created, we always call this init function. And just by creating an instance of the question object, it calls this init function by default. And the parameters that we want to pass into that initialize function is the object itself, which is referred to as self. We can call it anything, but I'm going to call it self here. The question and the answer. Okay, so just like you declare any other function, we define the function, give it a name, and in this case we're going to pass in some parameters. But init is a key, like a predefined function in Python. So what we do is we say take the object, which we've called self, and set the question of that object to equal question. So let's say, for example, this was a person object. Self would be me, and if this attribute was height, would pass in my height here. So we're actually giving the question property a value, and we're going to give it the value that gets passed in here. And I'll show you how to do that in a minute. So as well as setting the question of this object, we've also got to set a value for the answer. So we say the answer of this object here is equal to whatever answer you pass in here. Okay, so that's our initialize function set up, and that means that I can create as many questions as I want as long as I pass in a question and answer variable. And we could have other variables. We could say, well, actually I want to have a list of options for the answer. So then I just add another parameter here, and then I'd say set the options to be whatever options are passed in up here. But I'm not going to have options for this particular example. I just want to have a question and an answer. Keep it simple. So that's my properties. Well, that's my class setup that allows to assign values to my properties. The next thing I want to do is create a method, and a method is a function that does something within a class. So if you think about the stuff that we've been doing with the turtle objects, with our turtle class or our turtle object, we can set the position, so we can go to a certain point on the stage. We can move forward. We can, I think we can move backward. We can put the pen down, put the pen up. We can set a shape, change the shape of the turtle to look like a turtle or a circle or a square. So these are all, the move forward, move backwards are all methods within the turtle object. The things that have been created by somebody to allow you to do stuff with a turtle. Well, what I want to do with my question is I want to be allowed to ask my users the question and answer. So in that case, I need to create a method to allow me to do this, and that method's going to live within this question class. So I'm going to define a method called askQuestion, and I'm going to pass in an instance of my object, which is myself, and then I am going to get the user guess. So just like we did in the last video, we will get the user guess by using the input function, and the way that we're going to write out the question's a little different now, because I can actually get the question directly from this object here. So I just type in the object's name, which is self, and then I type out the question property of that object. And I'm just going to add a little question mark like we did before. Okay, and just like before, we can test the user's guess against the answer, but instead of writing answer this time, we can go to the self object and get the answer property of that object. So, and just like before, we can print out, if the guess is correct, we will print out correct, and if it's incorrect, I forgot my colon up the end again, just doing that, we will print out an incorrect message. Okay, so now I've got a class called question. I initialize it by setting the question and answer of the question object, and it's got a method called askQuestion, which allows me to ask the user a question. But I haven't actually created an instance of this question object yet. I've set the class up, but I haven't actually created an instance and passed in a value for the question or the answer. So what I'm going to do is create a question. And I am going to, can I do it this way? I'll give it a go and see what happens. So whenever you create a question, you need to call the question class or create an instance of the question class. So this is creating an instance of this here. You do an open and close parentheses, and then you pass in the question and answer. So I'm just going to move that down a bit to make it a bit more readable. So for each question class, you pass in a question. So how many sides does a pentagon have? and we also need to pass in an answer. Okay, so here we've created an instance of this question object, so it automatically knows when I create an instance of this object that this whole thing here is itself. It knows that this is the question because it's the first parameter that I'm passing in here, and this is the answer. It's the second parameter that I'm passing in here because they're separated by this comma here. Okay, if I just try to print out the question and answer, so let's see if it'll allow us to do this. Print question dot question. See what this does. I've not actually done this before, so because I'm used to working with a collection of questions. So all this questions. Save it. Doesn't make some. Oh, forgot. It said there was an end of a line issue here, and if you notice, I've got an opening speech mark but not a closing speech mark there. So we'll just try and run that again. Question has no attribute question. So you can't call it directly. You've got to create an instance of that class. Okay, we'll come back to that. That's okay. So this is how you create one instance of that question. But actually, I want to create an array of questions. And just like before, we create our array by giving it a name. And then remember, we use the square brackets and fill in our values in here. But instead of putting in a string or numbers for the values, I'm going to put in a question object. So here I have an array that has a single question object in there. Okay. So now, if I try to, let's just tidy this up a bit, print out the first question in that array. So remember how we get the first item in an array? Let me do this. Well, we'll try it out, see what we've got now to lose, have we? So it's good to play about anyhow. So if we go to the first item in the array and get the question attribute, oops, I think I might need to do a dot there. So this should get our first questions object and type out the question. Yeah, so we've got the first object in the questions array and typed out the question. If I change that to answer, it'll get the first item in the array and type out the answer. But no, so I'll just demonstrate that. So the answer is 5. So the difference is that, remember, in the last video we would just do that. So we would just use the index in the array to print out the value. Now if I try to do that, I'm guessing it'll cause us some sort of error here. Yeah, it's saying that, okay, yeah, I've got a question object, and it's actually trying to print out a reference to that entire object there. But if I want to just access one of the properties within there, I just put a dot and then the name of the property I want to access. Brilliant. So now I haven't actually done the ask question. I haven't called the ask question method, so I wouldn't expect that to work. So I'm just going to create some more instances. And remember, you put a comma in between every item in your array here. So the next question will be, what colour signifies danger? And this one's going to be a string. And the last one is, what year did the Bond movie, or was the Bond movie Spectre released? And the answer is 2015. So I've got an integer, a string, and an integer. And remember, we need to convert an integer to a string using this strut function here. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that print statement because I don't need it anymore. Now I need some sort of loop. So I've got a questions array with 3 question objects in. Each question has a question property, value for its question property, and a value for its answer property. But I want to loop through this array and I want to ask the question. I want to call this method. So it's quite nice the way you can do this actually, because in Python we can use this little for loop. So instead of saying, well, I want to determine how many questions are in there and only loop around my loop so many times like we did in the last video, we can actually use this for loop and say for each question in our questions array, do something. So I'm just going to do that. For question in questions just ask, call this method here, ask question. Sorry, I'm getting a bit distracted there. So for each question in the questions array, we will call the ask question method. Okay, so we're calling this ask question method and we're passing ourselves in. So when this happens for each question, I expect the question to be asked, I expect to be able to get the user input, and I expect to be able to test the user input against the question's answer. So let's just run that and see what happens. How many sides does a pentagon have? 5. Brilliant. What colour signifies danger? I'll deliberately put in a wrong answer so you can see that it hits the incorrect. What year was the Bond movie Spectre released? 2015. Correct. Brilliant. So now we've got a new way of setting up our questions and answers. And we're doing it in an object-oriented way because each of these is an instance of the question class, which means it's an object. And I'll just go over what we've done and add some comments just to sort of refresh you or remind you of what just went on there. So the first thing we did was we initialize the question object. We pass in itself. We also pass in the value of the question and a value for the answer. And then we set the question to be whatever value is passed in here. Set the question property to the value of the question and set the answer property to be the value of the answer. And then we create a method called askQuestion. Create a method called askQuestion and get the user's answer. And then we test the user's answer. So check the, put a little space at the beginning, keep it consistent. Check the user's answer against the object's answer. And lastly, we create an array. Well, not lastly. Next, we create an array of question objects. So here we're creating an instance of the question object and assigning it a value for the question and another value for the answer. We'll do that 3 times. Oh, just tidy this up here. and then we create a for loop to loop through each question in the question array. Now, what we did there was we asked each question sequentially as it appeared in here. Now, it's possible to randomize the order that these questions are asked using the random shuffle function. So I'm just going to leave that with you to go and have a think about. Have a look at the Python documentation, and you're looking for a random shuffle function for shuffling objects within an array. And that's it for this tutorial.